lecture today is by Vanessa Lynn. You may call her Vanessa, you may call her Miss Lynn, you may even call her Professor Lynn. She's a PhD candidate from Stony Brook University, and she will be talking today on restorative justice, as well as transitional justice, and a few of those justice paradigms that we introduced, but I know was very confusing last week. So with that being said, hopefully there will be a bit of restorative justice, as well as transitional justice, and a few of those justice. That's awful. Yeah, we're running out of seats, so that happened. Here is one. And with that being said, if anyone lives on campus and wants to volunteer your seat up to watch this online, you're more than welcome to. Very sorry about that. Here's a seat that you can roll anywhere. Here's another seat that we can roll anywhere. Well, you cannot roll this anyway.
Good morning. How is everyone today? So let's get started. Thank you, Professor Rodriguez, for having me here today. And we met at Stony Brook, right? Obviously. I was actually impressed to see you all being here so early. I teach in the city at Hunter, and I always start my class with 8 students. I guess they always get stuck on the subway, so I have my hats off to you guys for this punctuality. So today, she mentioned, I'm gonna talk about 2 concepts, 2 justice paradigms. First, restorative justice, and then transitional justice. By a show of hands, who has ever heard of transitional justice? You can say if you have heard, you can say no. You seem to be hesitating. Did you?
Well, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is.
Okay. And also, I just want to have a little bit of an overview. Who is a sociology major? Oh, criminology. Okay. And then psychology, what other majors? Psychology? Okay. Okay. So let's get into this. So when a crime occurs in our society, we suppose that certain things usually will happen, right? So there is assumptions when a crime occurs, and the first one is that the state authorities will take charge of the process of dispensing justice, right? We expect the justice system to be taken care of by the states. They will deliver justice. Another assumption that we all know is that the perpetrator of a crime will be tried in a law of court. Let me run down these assumptions real quick. The next one is, if an accused person is found guilty of a crime, their fate will be determined by a judge, a jury too. And the last one, this of an assumption is that the offender will be subjected to a form of punishment. So this is what we usually see, what we see predominantly in our crime shows, right? Law and Order, Criminal Minds. This is how the justice system is happening. And this is called a retributive justice system. It's all based on punishment, right? But now we're moving towards a society, and I'm sure you've been seeing that with Professor Rodriguez, right? With the new Jim Crow. We'll get into that in a little bit. Where we have this huge amount of people being incarcerated for longer amount of times for crimes that are not usually always violent. And so we have come in this time in our age, we are trying to consider other types of justice system. How can we respond to crime? What are the alternatives? And one of them is restorative justice. So what did you talk about? What is some ideas or concept that you talked about when you talked about restorative justice? So that I have an overview. Can anybody volunteer of what you think of what restorative justice is? Yes?
Restorative justice is based on helping the community and the offenders of crime. So,
okay.
So it's like, for example, like class counseling, sorry.
It's okay.
Class counseling and like the community just helping that person.
The community. Okay, good. Good. That's a very good start. So it involves the community. It involves the community of the offender as well. So So let me run down some new assumptions now. So because we have these assumptions of a retributive justice system, now we have to come up with new assumptions how we want to see justice happening when a crime occurs. What was your name actually? Can I?
Jessica.
Jessica, thank you, Jessica. So one new assumption that we have to think of is the key decisions are actually made outside of court by small groups of ordinary citizens, including the victim and the offender. So when we think of a new justice system, it's not just the state being involved. We have the community, we have the offenders community, family, and the victims as well. Another assumption is that here the focus is more on persuading or obligating offenders to repair the harm that they have caused through their criminal act. Another assumption is that practitioners actually prefer to bypass the process of legal trial and conviction altogether if the perpetrator admits his involvement in the crime. So obviously, if we're gonna go through this route, the person who has committed a crime has to take responsibility, accountability, to be willing to bypass this legal process. And now I want to jump right ahead into some restorative justice practices. It'll be easier to understand what this concept is about. So restorative justice has been going around in the country and throughout the world. There's thousands of practices. There's thousands of individuals and communities getting into this restorative justice practices. So I want to focus on 3 today. One is the victim offender mediation, family group conferencing is another one, and the last one is the peacemaking circle. So peacemaking circles can actually be called also sentencing circles. And so if you see, we have the stakeholders in the restorative justice. We have the community, as Jessica mentioned, the offender and the victim, and they all come together to dispense this to this justice. Let's get into this idea of our restorative justice continuum. So restorative justice practice are actually not limited to formal processes, such as the conferences and the example that we're going to see. But they actually range from informal to informal, right? So on this restorative justice continuum, the informal practices include making statements, communicating each other's feelings. And that's something we actually do. We resolve conflict with our significant others, with our parents, with our coworkers, right? In order to resolve this conflict, we have to communicate our feelings. We have to ask questions, right? And so this is part of informal restorative practice that we engage on in our everyday lives. So moving from left to right on the continuum, the restorative practices become more and more formal. They involve more people, and they require more planning, more time, more structure, and to be completed. So although a formal restorative process might have dramatic impact, these informal practices too, as we navigate through them and on our day-to-day life, right? So any questions so far? And let me know if I go too quickly. Too quick. So first, the victim offender mediation. A little background. It was started in the 70s in the US and in Europe. And so it offers the victims of a crime an opportunity to meet in a safe space, in a safe setting with the person who has harmed them. Another point is that the meeting is organized and structured by mediators. So these mediators actually encourage victims to tell offenders about how the offense affected their life. So, I'm pretty sure if anyone wants to volunteer, has anyone been a victim of a crime? Okay, so that might be too personal. I have, and I know that what would one question that you would want to ask if somebody harmed you? What would be a question you would want to confront the person who's harmed you? What would you want to ask them? Why? Exactly. Why? What else? why? But mainly why? Why me? What went through your mind? So all these questions, you're going to be in a room setting. You have an individual who is neutral, who doesn't know you or the crime perpetrator, and he's going to make sure that you can address all these questions, right? You're harmed. You're feeling vulnerable, and so you have a chance to confront the person and ask all these questions. Another point is, so the victim is actually, in these meetings, the victim will help in developing a restitution or reparation plan. So for example, somebody broke into your house, they stole something, and within this meeting, you're gonna say, well, first of all, why did you come through my house, and all these questions that you wanna address, and then this action plan can be, well, you're gonna take a year, no matter how long it takes, but let's take a restitution plan of a year, and you're gonna have to reimburse, you're gonna have to pay me back. These are the things that victims can say and demand in these meetings. The offender now has a chance to account, to tell their story, where they're coming from. Maybe some person was on, I'm giving you the idea of maybe somebody was on drugs and needed to provide for their drug addiction and then broke into a house. So all these stories can come out in these meetings. And they also contribute, the offenders, to the construction of an action plan for repairing the harm that they have caused. So that's one type of restorative justice practice. Now, the second type is the family group conferencing. And this was introduced in youth justice in New Zealand in the 80s. And it was a form of pre-trial diversion from the conventional criminal justice system. And it was a new way of dealing with the youth. So basically in New Zealand, we have this group, the Maori, who were concerned because what they were seeing is like all their kids, they were taken away from their home and being sent to courts, to prison. And it was very worrying them, and they wanted to be involved in the process of what was going on with all this youth delinquency. So in conferencing, this family group conferencing are really similar. It's in a lot of ways similar to the victim offender mediation, but here it includes more participants. You have the family members or anyone who support the victims, but also the family members and people in the community who present the offender. And so here, instead of having a mediator, we have a facilitator. And here there's also a greater emphasis on this action plan. It is also about helping repairing the harm, but also an action plan so that the youth, that the kid will have been involved in activities that will make them or keep them away from all these activities that we're doing, right? Delinquent activities, what they say. So going further, now we have these peacemaking circles, also called sentencing circles. They're also called healing circles. And they're based upon the traditional sanctioning and healing practices of Aboriginal people in North America. And they've been very widespread throughout America, and they were reintroduced in various Aboriginal communities in the 90s. So it's usually used at the sentencing stage of the criminal justice process. And here, in these circles, the number of participants are even greater, even much larger than family group conferencing. So here you actually have people from the court. You have the prosecutors, you can have the defense attorney, you can have social workers, and they're all in these, and everyone has a say in these circles. Everyone can voice their opinion. And there's usually a talking piece, so people have different objects. So we could have this cap, we could have this, and it's in the middle of the circle, and everyone who wants to take the voice will have to grab this piece to know that they are talking. So, so the decision here is focusing on the sentencing, right? How do we keep the youth going away to prisons? But basically, back to the victim offender mediation, all the parties involved are going to try to construct a plan to make sure that the kid, the youth, or whoever is involved in the criminal activity will remain in the community participate in community services, but it depends, of course, on the crime that is involved, right? So usually we're looking at these circles for non-serious, non-violent offenses, but in other cases it can be used in serious offenses too, where prison time will be offered, but in a lesser sentence. All right, so do I have questions so far? Are we okay? Yes. What's your name?
Priscilla.
Priscilla.
How does this work in terms of time? I mean, like a crime that would normally be 30 years in prison, I imagine you can spend even 15 years in group therapy.
Right, no. So again, it depends on the seriousness of the offense, right? So usually these programs, these restorative justice practices are not always referred to for all crimes involved. So it's going to be most of the time for non-serious crimes, non-violent, youth crimes, and they're not. And then depending on where you're located in the country, you have less opportunities. For New York, for example, I know in Long Island, actually in Hampstead, and I don't remember the other one. So these private community companies are going to be working with the courts so that the case is going to be referred to them, but there is only so few. It's not a prevalent mechanism that we have here. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. All right, so when we have programs, when we have policies and practices, we of course need to know if they're effective or not. Does this work, right? And so we have some evaluation research, program evaluation research. They're all focusing on measuring whether this works or not. So in general, what we see is that the victims actually do better compared with people who are not going through these processes of restorative justice. They do better across a wide range of outcomes, such as post-traumatic stress. For example, being victim of crime is usually traumatic. And so the victims do better, right, on this after they go through this. Another outcome is that it reduces, it diminishes the frequency and the severity of reoffending. So I'm sure you heard about the term recidivism by now. Yes, so usually it reduces recidivism, but also about the severity of the offense, that people are going to be committing a new crime or not. The other point is that it increases offender responsibility and accountability. Of course, we need people who have committed a crime to take responsibility, but for them to take this, taking these actions allows them to take greater responsibility and accountability. And then finally, it provides reassurance to the local community concerning fears of victimization. So we have the community being involved, right, in these practices, and it gives them another means of reassuring themselves that they're taking control of their community as well, right? So this is how I wanted to cover restorative justice in a nutshell. Does this give you a good idea of where we're moving from? So to summarize, we have different stakeholders. We have the community, the victims community, the victims social network. We have the offenders community and social network. They are all involved to find a way to heal, right? We need the victims to heal, right? We have a crime that occurred that is traumatic. And we also need the community to be also involved, because we have these victims and offenders that are navigating with this community. We want safe communities. And the offender, we want an offender who's not going to commit a new crime. We want somebody, an individual who's going to come back to a community and being productive, let's say. But let's move forward and talk about transitional justice. Yes.
So
your name?
Irene.
Irene.
So would they take away jails as a whole, or?
Okay, so as it is practiced right now, no, right? We have people going to prison. So again, this is happening only for certain cases. For kids, usually when we try to keep kids away from prison, we put them in these programs, these practices. Even for adults who are involved in non-serious, non-violent crimes, because we know we have non-violent crimes where people would be more it would be more helpful for them to be going to a drug program. So these meetings, this restorative justice practice, the action plan can be community service, drug treatment, or going to school, or giving money, right? Because you stolen something, you have to give it back. So all of these are the ways of going about making this action plan. But then not all crimes are going to be referred to these programs, right? If somebody killed someone, they most likely will be going to court. But I mean, I want to give an example from a TV show. Who's watching How to Get Away with Murder? Okay, so in one episode, I don't remember.
Discretion, I gave a brief thing of this particular episode.
Okay, so this is the example. This is a violent crime, but these are two kids, right? They might have known each other or whatever. But the mother of the victim, she didn't want to see the perpetrator going through the criminal justice system because she knew it was not going to help him. So sometimes the victim's family, the victim's community can maybe actually go towards the court and ask for this alternative. But it's not a so prevalent thing. We see that on TV, but I wouldn't assume that's something that happens really quite often, really. That doesn't represent reality, what I would say.
So say the victim in this case would be like a minor for whatever reason. Like say it's like a juvenile against a juvenile.
Okay.
And so the minor has heard of this transitional justice and they're willing to participate in it, but the parents and the family are not.
Okay.
Who gets to say at that?
That's a good question. So first of all, let me correct. It's not the transitional justice, it's restorative justice. Right. So I would assume then that the court can actually have the mediator trying to talk to family, because you have this person who's a mediator, a facilitator, a person who comes outside. He's not part of the court, right? They're trained to actually come in between the parties, the two parties involved, and mediate between the two. So yes, that would be your answer. That's what I would assume. Yes.
You said that all of these are for non-violent crimes. Is this type of restorative justice, is it made for non-violent crimes then?
No, it is usually it usually happens for non-violent crime, but it's also a means, for example, for sex offenders. These are things that happen also for the sex offenders population. It's not going to be referred for most of violent crimes. However, I am not aware. This is still new for me, by the way. I mean, new. This is my first time lecturing on this, but I would assume that most, we live in a country that is very geared toward punishment, right? And I'm sure you've seen that with the new Jim Crow from Michelle Alexander. It was all about incarceration. So these alternatives for violent crimes as well is not going to be a prevalent practice, right? It's not going to be accepted too, right?
The question is, in theory, could it be for any crime?
In theory, yes. In theory, yes. All right. Is that okay? All right, let's move a little forward with this idea of transitional justice. And I'm going to read this quote that it's a definition from the International Center for Transitional Justice. So transitional justice is a response to systematic or widespread violations of human rights. It seeks recognition for the victims and to promote possibilities for peace, reconciliation, and democracy. Transitional justice is not a special kind of justice, but justice adapted to societies transforming themselves after a period of pervasive human rights abuse. In some cases, these transformations happen suddenly. In others, they may take place over decades. So we have this idea of violation of human rights. We have this idea of societies transforming themselves after a period of human rights abuse. Let's move straight into the practices. I'm a practice person. I like to talk about practices. For today, let's change a little bit, right? So there's some core elements to these practices. And first, we have this idea of criminal prosecution. So in transitional justice, we have criminal prosecution, right? So usually it's particularly for the perpetrators that are considered to be the most responsible. And we'll have more examples in a little bit. Another example or elements are reparations. So the government recognizes and takes steps to address the harms that was suffered by a people, by population. And so initiative can be material elements. It could be money, it could be cash payments or health services or any community services. But also it has a symbolic aspect. So it can be a public apology or starting a national holiday. Those are part of reparation. Then we also have institutional reforms from abusive states, such as when the military forces, armed forces, police, and courts, to dismantle there's something structural that happened for these human rights abuses to happen, right? So we need also institutional reform to reverse what happened. And then the final are the truth commissions. There are means to investigate and report on systematic patterns of abuse, and they recommend changes and help understand the underlying causes of what happened. What was the human rights violation? Why did this happen? They're about investigating those. So this is not a closed list. Countries have adapted those and used those and maybe expanded on those. So now, based on that, can anybody think of one major event in history that has started these processes of human rights violation? An example of a worldwide human rights violation throughout history. Can anybody think of an example in the world? One country that has perpetrated crimes.
Genocides, like any sort of genocide.
Okay, yes, right. The first one, the initiation of the transitional justice is considered to be started by these Nuremberg trials. Have you all heard of the Nuremberg trials? Yes? Can somebody tell me what they were? Yes, what's your name?
Jacob.
Jacob?
It was an international trial to try the Nazi high officials for crimes against humanity.
Right, exactly. So we have, after Second World War, we have these trials. It was a model of accountability focusing on individual responsibility that took place in Germany after the Second World War. Now, trials, I'm sure so we don't have many sociology major. Who has heard of Emil Durkheim, sociologist? One, few. So Emil Durkheim, for him, he thinks that we need trials in order to reinforce social solidarity. It's about reinforcing moral values. So trials are needed, but trials also focus solely on the perpetrators, right? And so we have now in our day, on contemporary days, we have the International Criminal Court. Did anyone hear the news this morning or read the news? And that was the International Criminal Court was mentioned? No? Too early. So this morning, I just heard that the International Criminal Court is considering investigating military from the US for torture crimes in Afghanistan. So the idea is that the International Criminal Court, actually, the US is not recognizing the criminal court. But because the crimes happened in Afghanistan, the victims were in Afghanistan, they're considering opening an investigation and prosecuting even members of the CIA and members of the military in the US for torture against Afghanistan. So this is the way of going about resolving crimes against humanity, genocides, and war crimes. The International Criminal Court is focusing on that. But there's been a lot of policymakers that have been looking at how can this be more holistic, right? The victims here don't have much of a say. The victims here are not much involved in this process. And so there's got to be a shift. And then let's look into another example of a major event in the world. I'm going to put some pictures. Who has ever heard, I hope you have, about what the apartheid is and where did this happen? What's your name?
Ojane. I'm South Africa.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what apartheid was?
Basically like
South African version of segregation. So it was a white minority basically taking over a white majority, like everything was put down the middle, like off of one side of the street. You support them.
Okay. It definitely was a system of racial segregation in South Africa, and it was enforced through legislation by the National Party there. And it was the governing party from 48 to 94. So it was not just a separation, the segregating separation. It was also a violent backlash between the different parties, and also a backlash for people trying to overthrow this segregation regime. So the first application of this restorative justice, this has an element of restorative justice within transitional justice. Do I have you here? Okay. So this is actually about the post-conflict situation, and I have a little bit of video. It's a very short video that will explain this better than I do. Not explain, but give you the voices too.
I may have done it.
I won't know.
I may have done it.
To listen to the victims of human rights abuses, to provide reparation, and to grant amnesty. These were the three main tasks of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The scope of the commission dated from the 1960s right through to 1994, including the Shell House massacre, the murder of Communist Party leader Chris Hani, and the St. James Church attack in Cape Town. While many wanted answers around high-profile killings and disappearances, it was the everyday brutality of the apartheid system that came to characterize much of the hearings. For some, it was all too much. The perpetrators also had to be heard. In planning the commission, some had argued for a punitive system like the Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted Nazi criminals. But in the end, the DRC chose a more conciliatory approach. Applicants had to prove their acts were politically motivated and make a full disclosure to receive clemency. Shocking scenes of torture were reenacted for the commission. ANC bomber Robert McBride and former police hit squad commander Dirk Coetzee were both granted amnesty. Chris Hani's killers, Janus Valus and Clyde Darby Lewis, were not. But many chose not to apply for amnesty, among them high-ranking former government officials. Apartheid-era chemical warfare expert Dr. Wouter Basson was one of them. He later went to trial, but the state found insufficient evidence to convict him. The commission formally ended in 2001. Of the more than 7,000 amnesty applications, less than 1,000 were granted. And the matter of reparations continues to be a bone of contention for many victims. While not perfect, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been used as a model by other countries seeking reconciliation.
You deserve to know more. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted for you to have a little bit more images of what we're talking about in terms of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I'm going to give you, of course, my the major points of what the goals are, right? So first we have about unearthing, clarifying, acknowledging what these past violations. So there's a forum. Imagine a big forum of people saying, well, I've been harmed. My mother was killed. So you have a forum where you can actually voice how you've been victimized. It's about also responding to the victim's needs in theory. We'll go in a little bit of these theoretical ideas. In theory, it's about responding to the victim's needs. And it's about creating a culture of accountability and respect for the rule of law. So we know that in these events, a lot of laws were, like people were above the law, right? Everybody took upon themselves and do what they want and kill whoever they want just for the sake of being in this segregated, racially segregated area. It's about also outlining the institutional responsibility and again, having reforms, institutional reforms. And so to advance the prospect of reconciliation and reduce historical conflict over the past. So this reconciliation is very key, right? We have two groups that were living segregated. It's about trying to find a way to be peace, right? For people to finally live together, right? But, so there's different types of truth and reconciliation commission. One is a participatory model. So it's fostering reconciliation by public dialogue and collective acknowledgement. So the South African is an example. And then there's more also educational fact-finding bodies. They're about encouraging historical interpretation and disseminating a collective memory. So it's about remembering what happened, right? It's about educating about what happened. There's some more characteristics, right? So from this little video, we hear that they investigate. So the Truth Reconciliation Commissions combine investigative, judicial, political, educational, therapeutic, and even spiritual functions. But in most of these commissions, the state asks individuals to renounce their desire for prosecution and revenge, basically, in the name of national reconciliation, as the focus is about healing and reparation rather than punishment. So one of the main characteristics of these Truth and Reconciliation Commission is about they do not have prosecutorial power. So here in these videos, we heard individuals getting amnesty. So forgiveness is actually really important. It's about forgiveness. It's the functioning and the philosophy behind transitional justice. So these commissions are often come with national programs of amnesty in the name, again, of healing. It's all about healing and reconciliation. Any questions from this and what you've seen in the video? Okay, can anybody think of something wrong with this idea of reconciliation, acknowledging the past, having these sort of forum, right, of everybody acknowledging the past and trying to find a common ground of moving forward and reconciliating two bodies? Can anybody think of something, some limitations? Let's get into the limitations. Yes. Remind me your name?
Irene.
Irene, sorry.
Maybe like people, because if someone's victimized by someone, I feel like they wouldn't want to talk to them or associate with them. So
yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we want to know why somebody did something to us, but do we always want to know why? When you're harmed, you want to know why? What do you want to do? You want them to be punished, of course, that too. Why do you have to forgive, right? Is forgiveness that easy, actually? But let's go with Irene's first point. Well, actually, yes, this is my next slide, but it's coming on the next slide. But let's focus here on this idea that there's an attempt here to build a consensus, right, about the past and how that past was problematic. Was it problematic for the whites in South Africa, this violence? Maybe some of them it was not, right? So is such a consensus actually possible? Do we all share the same opinion, right? We are all individuals with our own opinion. And in this process, we cannot possibly all share the same moral values. And so this idea that these bodies are trying to go towards a consensus of what happened, it is not always possible. Because we have this post-conflict society that are actually really divided. They were divided before, they are still divided after the conflict, right? So it is usually very difficult for citizens to agree on one single version of the conflict, right? That's kind of easy. I mean, easy. That kind of, right? Makes sense, right? So these commissions are bound to determine what is included and what should be left out in the historical account of what happened. And any attempt to impose a single version of history could also be counterproductive. And it could risk of provoking some backlash, right? If we're trying to say this is one thing that happened, one single version. And so legitimating narrative produced by these commissions might end up imposing a top-down, authoritative historical account of the past, which kind of blocks away the plurality of experiences. Now moving to another set of limitations, and I want to go with Irene's first one. Being victim of a crime, being victim is usually a traumatic experience, and when you have to tell the story again, it's traumatic again. So we know, for example, victims of sexual offenses, domestic violence, they usually don't even come forward, right, in the first place. But it's very traumatizing to sit in a court and tell your story in front of a whole body of people you don't know. So there's definitely a re-traumatization of for people who might have not been even healed. They were trying, move on. So sometimes you bring back old memories. It's not pleasant. There's this idea that the rights of the alleged perpetrators were not always respected, because people were all actually wanted to be punished, right? We want to punish the people who were perpetrating a crime. And so usually, again, it was about an amnesty program. This Truth and Reconciliation have no prosecutorial power. Nobody could be actually. But in this video, we saw that some people were prosecuted. So their rights were not always respected. And then there's a paradox here. On the one hand, we must satisfy the public need for exposure. We're exposing the wrongdoing. And on the other hand, we must make sure that there's a fair treatment of those accused of wrongdoing. So there's a paradox. We have somebody who did something wrong, and yet we cannot punish them. That's the paradox that some of the victims have to deal with. And then in the spirit of understanding, it can actually go too far. It can actually obliterate the victim's right to seek legal redress, right? It can actually victimize the person again by not having them a say of wanting to see somebody being prosecuted. And so let me show you a quote here. Somebody, a victim of, a South African victim of the apartheid said, "The oppression was bad, but what is much worse, what it makes me even more angry, is that they are trying to dictate my forgiveness." They're telling people, the victims, that they have to forgive in these conditions, that nobody's gonna get punished. So for them, it was also another way of being harmed. So there's definitely limitations to transitional justice. Now I wanna bring this home, and in a little bit, we're gonna bring it home. But before, another idea, another type of justice that we have to think about is social justice. So transitional justice usually is more focusing on political violence rather than economic, social, and structural violence. So the aim of the transition is the establishment of a liberal regime, both politically and economically, right? So a regime where pluralist views coexist and where no one will be giving preferential treatment based on their political or ethnic origins. So since after 10 years, right, of South Africa, after this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people were thinking this Truth and Reconciliation Commission was going to create this rainbow nation. But in the truth, even though this data is from 1998, which is really shortly after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission ended, 61% of Black South Africans still lived in poverty in 98, and only 1% of whites do. So as a result of this deception, many people in South Africa, the victims, argued that the programs of redistributive social justice would have been more effective, right? All the money that they spent in creating this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they argue should have been given to them towards social services, community services, health services, right? So how could that money could have been better spent to help the victims? And the argument was to redistribute the money in that way. So now let's bring this home. Can anybody think or know of instances of restorative, transitional justice practice in the US and recent? Okay, let me tell you why we need to bring this home and why it's actually coming home. Broadening the scope of transitional justice and transition might also be understood geographically so as to include democratic countries in the Northern Hemisphere too. So this would mean acknowledging that every society is in transition. Even democratic societies have their share of unacknowledged past injustices whose effects are corrosive and deep. So we have the effects of America's brutality against Black Americans, which continue to corrode this democracy today and continue to endless cycles of violence and distrust. So now this is really hitting home, and specifically for what's happening today for the past few years, because it has reached our TV screens, right? We know of police brutality is happening, but it has happened for a long time. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new here, right? Again, can anybody think of an example of transitional justice? No? All right, so let me give you two examples.
I was going to say, what do you call it? That when you go to college, you have more chances if you're from a minority group. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that could be considered an institutional reform. That is institutional. After Jim Crow, we had this institutional reform to redress the inequality. Definitely. Good. I wanted to give you two examples. The Greensboro Truth Reconciliation Commission in North Carolina. And there was this case of Chicago police torture that gave a whole reparation program. So two videos that will explain this quickly.
On a bright November morning in 1979, the sound of gunshots and shouting pierced the fall air of Greensboro, North Carolina.
We were organizing textile workers, and in 1979, that was still an uphill struggle. And we were having a major rally to promote that work. What we wasn't aware of is that the Greensboro police had put together a racist united front for the specific purpose of coming to disrupt the march. Klan and Nazis took weapons out of the trunk of their cars and fired into that group of people gathering for a march. Jim Waller was shot in the back and killed. Cesar Causé was shot in the chest and killed. William Sampson was shot in the face. Sandy Smith was shot in the head and killed. And Michael Nathan was shot in the face as he was trying to render service to William Sampson. And all of this was videotaped. The shots were pretty clear on the television.
In spite of this blatant act of violence, 2 subsequent criminal trials acquitted the shooters of any wrongdoing.
What does it take to confuse and frighten a community to the extent that it actually denies what it saw with its eyes?
In an effort to help the Greensboro community heal, Nelson and Joyce Johnson began work to form a local Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1999. It was modeled on a similar one that shaped post-apartheid South Africa.
It said, in effect, that we are dedicated to carrying out the truth process. with the intent of actually promoting forgiveness and healing.
Greensboro became an open classroom as citizens took part in hearings, town hall meetings, and petition drives. The Johnsons brought labor, women's, civic, and religious groups to the table to improve the lives of those affected. They brought former Nazis and Klansmen face to face with relatives of their victims, helping both to release long-held pain.
So I believe that the hope of our city is not to run from its yesterdays, but to face its yesterdays, so that the yesterdays will not be its tomorrows.
Okay, so what are some of the elements from this video that you that we heard and we know of? So the elements, right, before. Here, let's focus on these elements, right? What are the elements of this Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened? What are the elements?
Forgiveness.
Yeah, right.
Well, they had no power
They had-
because they already told them like that's done. That's
Right.
over.
So there was initially, before they started this commission, there was those who were killed, the protesters were put in front of the court, but they were acquitted twice. They were found not guilty by a whole white jury. So we are in the 70s, right? In North Carolina. I found out that North Carolina has the most Ku Klux Klan members in America. In the 70s, I don't even know what it would look like. My father actually is from North Carolina. He shipped away from North Carolina to go play basketball in Belgium. So I'm sure he was lucky, to not have dealt with that. But it was pretty tense. And so they were acquitted. And then in a response for them to move on, for the victims and the community to move on, they created this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What this document is not saying is that they invited the mayor of Greensboro. They invited public officials who actually refused to go and did not recognize the legitimacy of this Reconciliation Commission. But it moved forward and they found crime perpetrators to participate and go on to this discussion and acknowledging the past. So in a nutshell, it was a pretty effective body that allowed the victims to voice, right? To voice their trauma, to voice their experiences in here. And also for the generation coming afterwards, right? We have the victims, but we also have the children, the family of the victims who are actually moving with this trauma as well. What happens to our parents kind of traumatizes us. We know what our parents went through is gonna affect us as well, right? We can agree on that, I hope, maybe not. So the second example is something that came about in the news a couple years ago, and that's based on Chicago and police torture. Let's go into this.
Let's tighten it up a little bit.
Ronald Kitchen never thought he'd hear these words.
We have ways of making it talk.
Kitchen was not being held against his will by men in white hoods or neo-Nazis. He was in the hands of the Chicago PD.
What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna introduce you to the telephone book in the nightstick. Then get the telephone book, this stick, and use the big old nightstick, put it on top of your head, and he just beats of it. So I'm sitting there, and as he telling me, you did this. We know you did this.
This was a highly publicized quintuple murder. But when police picked up Kitchen, he says they told him it was for auto theft.
He get his nightstick, and he put that nightstick between my legs. And he put it against the wall, and he lifts me off my feet. And he grinds. And he grinds, and he grinds, and he grinds.
For more than 16 hours, Kitchen says, a revolving door of officers beat and interrogated him until he had no fight left.
So I'm okay. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Whatever you want me to do, I'll do it.
He'll sign a confession.
I'll sign.
Based solely on his confession, and the testimony of an imprisoned informant who was later discredited, Kitchen was found guilty of all 5 murders and sentenced to death.
The city tried to keep these reports from being released.
In 1989, working on a tip,
3 years.
investigative journalist John Conroy discovered hauntingly similar reports from suspects claiming to be tortured by Chicago police. Give us a sense of the type of torture that was used by the officers.
Well, the most well-known is electric shock, and there were, as far as we know, 3 electrical devices. There also was one prisoner, Andrew Wilson, who was burned against a hot radiator.
At the center of it all was one man. John Burge is a former Chicago Police Department commander and the face of this dark chapter in Chicago's history.
I will assert my Fifth Amendment right.
Burge was eventually convicted, not for the torture itself, because the statute of limitations had run out, but for lying about it. He spent 4.5 years behind bars for perjury and obstruction of justice. Today, he's a free man, and he still receives his police pension. This year, Chicago became the first city in the nation to approve a reparations ordinance for victims of police abuse and torture. Ronald Kitchen isn't eligible for reparations because he already received a multi-million-dollar civil settlement from the city of Chicago. Lisa Fletcher, Al Jazeera, Chicago.
Okay. So was this story familiar to anyone? No. So actually, I had a hard time finding any news clips, videos from this online. So it is not something we've heard about. Why would that be? So why would you think that this is not something we're going to hear about? Let's speculate here. What is it? Yes. Can you tell me your name?
Maggie.
Maggie.
It's within like a police institution, and it's in their best interest to keep it quiet, and they have the power to keep it quiet.
Okay, that's definitely valid. Definitely. What is the taboo word in here? What is taboo in this Chicago police torture of the outcome? What happened? The outcome was reparation. I just gave you the answer. Is reparation taboo? Reparation is usually a taboo word. Reparation is not liked. But they went far and wide here. So there was criminal prosecution, right? The cop who ignored and lied about this torture was found guilty, and he spent 4.5 years in prison. So this one element of transitional justice. But then reparation is about, it's another element of transitional justice that I explained. Reparation involves either material, like cash, or also it can be symbolic. It can be also community service. It can be, and so in this case in Chicago, the victims, but also the victims' family, their descendants were given financially for college, counseling services, and the likes. It's not just giving people money, but giving them services that it would need in order to move on, right? So reparation in here was, at first they were really reticent. They didn't want to go as far as asking for reparation, but the city of Chicago actually approved, and it was a major win. It was a major win in fighting against police brutality. So now let's move a little bit more with what you have been talking about, I'm sure, in class, and that's the new Jim Crow. You've read the book by now, right? So I guess we'll move for more discussion, because you know already that the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, and yet the U.S. has 25% of the prison population. So that just shows the amount, the disproportionality of people in being incarcerated. The U.S. is the #1 country that incarcerates people. So that's problematic, more than problematic, right? And then so what Michelle Alexander has focused on is the war on drugs for creating this mass incarceration, and particularly this disparity in sentencing from crack to cocaine, even though we know that both are the same. Yet we also understand that people who consume, sell, or whatever crack are going to be Black, Latinos, and the cocaine users and distributors, etc., are going to be white. So we have people, Black and Latinos, being incarcerated at a faster and a higher rate. You all know that. So now we are at a time right now where, well, things are changing. This is a slide that I have for my class last semester. I don't know what's going to happen next, but back then, last year, we had this bipartisan, right? It used to be a whole tough on crime era, right? You had to be tough, but now people realize that we're spending too much money in prisons. We're not rehabilitating people. People are keep coming back in and out. So we have this bipartisan movement effort to be what they call smart on crime, right on crime. It can be either Republicans or Democrats. There's also this popular movement where we have everybody, and you know, it comes in your shows now. You have your criminal shows. They'll mention mass incarceration. This mass incarceration is not just now in the books; it's in the mainstream, mainstream news, but also in mainstream popular movies and shows. And we have also a movement to end the war on drugs, as we know it, the attack on crime created this mass incarceration, and we also have the movement for Black Lives Matter movement. So with the new Jim Crow, you have seen how throughout history we have movements that to go towards more racial equality and racial progress, and all these movements are going towards that. But now we have our president who, in just an 8 period, the president has issued 2 rounds of grant sentence commutation. But he is, in history, the one president who has given the most sentence commutations, and all for drug offense, right? So we had these people who were in prison for 15 to life, 25 to life, and he trying to resolve that. So this is a movement already to trying to thwart this mass incarceration. So President Obama has done one thing in going this way. He also has signed a legislation, I believe it was in 2009, reducing the disparity. Instead of being from 100 to 1 for crack to cocaine, now it's 17 to 1. It's still not 1 to 1, even though they're both the same, right? Crack is cocaine, right? So now we have another issue, and I'm sure you're aware of that and you've heard about this, and it's the heroin. They want to call it the heroin epidemic, right? So there's actually more death from heroin overdose than murder. Heroin is the getaway prescription painkiller. It's no longer looked at drug is now addiction. Drug is now looked at something that happens in urban communities. That was the initial idea, right? Now it's something that we see happening in the suburbs, rural areas, and what I hear is that Long Island has a big issue with heroin, actually. So with this increase of death, now we have policymakers, elected officials who are actually embracing this idea of looking at drugs as public health. It's not a crime issue, it's a public health issue. Why? Why do you think we've changed from a crime issue to a public health issue? Yeah, right? Now we have consumers, heroin are predominantly white, and back in the days we had crack, the issue was, you know, Black people. So now the issue has turned from a crime and public health issue. It is just as simple as that. We can just call it like that. It's a race card, it's a race issue. So there's a call for a gentle war on drugs. People are across the board are trying to address this issue, and I want to end it with you guys today and asking you what is actually the way forward. How do we go from here? How can we bring transitional justice to address reversing the war on drugs, addressing the war on drugs issue? And that's what I have for you as a question and to go on in your lives and in your day. And that's what I have for you today. Do you guys want to answer? How do you think we can bring restorative and transitional justice to address this mass incarceration and war on drugs? Well, I mean, so of course we don't have to give the answer now, but as you go on in your careers, I hope you can imagine a world where we can address things in a more holistic ways, and we involve the communities, the victims, the offenders all together. That's pretty much the way forward, as I would imagine.
I think the same thing Portugal did, take away the money from the war on drugs, legalize the substances, and put that money in rehabilitation centers.
Good, very good. Look at how other countries are dealing with drug issues, and Portugal is usually a country that's being referred to in comparison. But so legalizing all drugs, I'm not sure if Portugal has legalized all drugs, but in here we've seen now legalizing marijuana is not so far-fetched. It's happening in our lifetime. We can assume that marijuana will be legal in New York, so that's one step towards legalization, and that's legalizing marijuana.
I saw where when Obama was like commuting sentences, he was mandating drug rehabilitation also,
right,
as like a stipulation of their release. So
right.
He wasn't just kind of like
Of
throwing
course.
them back on the streets. He was saying you have to go through drug treatment so
Absolutely.
that you're not reoffending.
Right, definitely. So people released from prison are not sent back to the streets. They are released to a halfway house. So it's another facility in order to transition back into community. And these halfway houses are usually have substance abuse programs. They have counseling programs. They have vocational programs, right? Helping people work on their resume and their interviewing skills, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely there's a structure, supposedly, right? That's supposed to help them transition back into society.
Does anyone know the difference between decriminalizing and legalizing something?
When something is decriminalized, it's kind of just like it's not legal, but you won't get you'll get a fine instead of getting arrested for it.
So that's a part of decriminalizing, right? Would be changing it. So maybe in certain ways, like what we're seeing with marijuana. You might be fined. It then becomes a rupture of civil law, but not criminal law. Okay, so remembering that, but that's a part of decriminalizing. Legalizing, though, would would have positive statutes that then allow for the selling and whatnot. So I don't think that's necessarily the case with heroin, right? We wouldn't be looking to legalize it, but it would be decriminalizing it so that it's not a criminal issue and then goes toward everything Vanessa was saying.
Women who are pregnant who are on drugs right now in this country, if you try to seek drug treatment or medical treatment, like you go to the doctor, they're mandatory reporters, so you can be sent to jail for child endangerment of your fetus, rather than, and no rehab programs will take you because you're pregnant.
Right.
So decriminalization would be allowing these women to get treatment instead of being punitive. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So could we have anyone kind of summarize what restorative justice is then in terms of the practices, how that's different from transitional justice? Just some takeaways from this. I'm very patient. How is restorative justice different than transitional justice? Thank you, Sam.
Restorative justice is to help the community, pretty much. It's to help the help the community offender. Restorative is state authorities take charge of the process of dispensing justice.
So that's retributive, right? Restorative is that first element that you were talking about, Kendra.
My understanding, it seems like restorative is more like a personal case kind of scenario, like she did something to me, and the transitional was more like a human rights violation, mass, kind of thing.
Good, great. So a really key part and a key thing to take away from this lecture is that the transitional justice, that was in the cases largely of state violence, right? Or the crimes against humanities, state-sanctioned violence in any kind of way. Then you would set up that type of tribunal or commission, right? Which is a little bit different in terms of the scale than what we see with restorative justice, but it has elements of restoration a part of it, right? So remember that we were talking about restitution, and we've talked about healing and that kind of involvement being central to restorative justice. Transitional justice has that as well, but what we saw were it's an institutionalized. It's on that level, right, of institutions, of state policy, of these types of things coming about. And you really didn't pick up too much, or I didn't hear too much of you in terms of what the benefits, but we definitely heard the limitations with transitional justice. But can anybody kind of bring up any of those benefits that you heard? What do you think comes out that is positive about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for apartheid, right? Or what we witnessed for Greensboro? Why do people advocate for that?
Well, I don't know if this is why they advocate for it, but you have kind of a better record of being able to say, hey, look, this happened, and everybody deemed that it was wrong, so don't do it again, or we're gonna have to go through this again. Like, there's less leeway to say that didn't happen and it's not how it happened.
Great. Yeah, so there's something beneficial about that exposure in and of itself, right? We know everything that happened in South Africa because the victims and the offenders, they had a chance to share that. Many of them without fearing punitive sentence for their involvement, right? But at least knowing that they would have a chance to share that. That was outside of a regular court, right? With that being said, we also see that there haven't been tremendous changes in the social and political reality there. What we do have is there is no impunity anymore. There is no cross-racial violence with impunity anymore. And that in and of itself is significant, right? We haven't had a Truth and Reconciliation set up here for Jim Crow, let's say, right? What we see from Jim Crow and what we know about it, strictly from TV and a few select autobiographies, right? But, for a large part, you don't know necessarily if you're from the South, your grandpa's role in it. You don't know your great-grandpa's role in it. You don't know the community relations as it goes to your family legacy, right? Which is very different in terms of the way forward and what we see with cross-racial violence today, remaining the way that it is, right? So there is a reason why these are set up. But with that said, there are a ton of limitations. And the fact that you can't then individually go for a punitive sentence against your offender is one of those very large ones, right? They also made sure that the political structure, the government in South Africa was then changed, right? So they formalized avenues for Black representation in their government because of the anti-apartheid movement and because of that end, right? That was Nelson Mandela coming and becoming the president. Okay, so there are kind of structural reasons why this can be important when you have a period of violence that spans maybe 50 years, like that case, and also in our case here in the US. Right? With that being said, there are several limitations. So I feel like, if there were some great takeaways from that, let that be one of them. Does anyone have any other takeaways or feedback?
I had a question. In the restorative justice, do they have records afterwards? Like, do you have a registry records of your crime?
No, in transitional justice, right? Since there's no prosecution, no, they're giving amnesty. They're not going through the court system. They're not. They don't have a record.
So you don't have a record that follows you.
Right.
The non-transformative in
transitional.
That was transitional.
Yeah,
restorative.
Restorative.
The restorative justice, that's a good question that I will look up and give the answer to your professor. I'm pretty sure it depends if the court is involved. So usually the court is out of the equation, but in family conferences and sentencing circles, the court, if specifically the sentencing circle, the peacemaking circles, right? The courts are involved in there. So I'm pretty sure, yes, they have a record. But for the victim, the victim offender mediation, I am not sure.
I'm just saying, wouldn't that be a limitation when profiling them? I mean, when a crime occurs,
If
you
they,
don't have records of the criminals, so it will be hard
right.
looking for the repeat offender
Right.
because you don't have records.
So in that sense, you just gave the answer. They must have a record somewhere because they are following, because they're trying to measure whether that person is going to reoffend or not, right? So that's the outcome. The goal is to find out whether it actually is effective in reducing reoffending. So I will double check, but now that you mentioned, yes, they must have a record.
I think an important thing is it depends how it works, right? So we know that some restorative justice practices are mediated through a court or a formal structure, right? That involves sometimes some type of arrest,
yeah.
Right? That is in and of itself a record.
Yeah.
If these are small communities, so say, you know, the way that this was born from Aboriginal groups, from Indigenous people here, et cetera, right? That's a community. You have a record in your community, yeah. You know, in that sense of memory. But whether or not it's a government, like official data, that can be different.
What if a person doesn't want to go to rehab? Like, you know how like my cousin, like he's been in rehab, like the court's like he has to go to rehab, but he goes and then just leaves after like a day or two and goes missing, and like ends up back in jail and gets released, but like he just didn't go to rehab. He said he'd rather be in jail.
Then he ends up
Like,
back in jail.
That's like a thing. Like
they're
they'll
gonna
have
go.
an option.
Well, his option is either go or
Jail.
get picked up and
Okay.
go back to jail, right?
Okay.
So until he gets to the point where somebody convinces him or something
Yeah.
within him that convinces himself that he needs this program.
Yeah, because like he doesn't care. Like he'd rather do drugs than.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Any last questions? All right, I want everyone to thank Vanessa.
Thank
So an important thing, if you have not yet turned it in, your group project should have one little note, right, that I told you about last week. So please turn in that paper or write that up now. We have about 10 minutes left in class. That is who attended the meeting, who is the group leader, and then what direction your project is going to go into.